So I'm going to just start with a disclaimer. I'm not going to show you a single image of a warm, fuzzy mammal, predator or otherwise. In fact, I'm not going to show you a single image at all. I live in Panama, and so I'd like to, in your minds, just take you all to Panama with me. And right now, it's the end of the dry season, and so it's hot. It's been really hot, and it's been really bright. But instead of it being bright and sunny, I'd like you to imagine that the skies are black, that it's just raining buckets and buckets and buckets of water. The storm has been going on for a week, and it's the end of the rainy season, and the rivers are swollen with water. And they're so swollen that they're almost overcoming the bridges, and the city streets are flooded. Well, that exact same thing happened starting December 7th in 2010. At the end of what was already on track to be one of the wettest years on record, we had the flood of record in the Panama Canal watershed. There was so much water that the Panama Canal Authority had to close the canal for shipping. They had to open up all the floodgates and the locks and evacuate as much water as fast, efficiently, and safely as possible. Now, this is a big deal. This is the first time they'd done anything like this in some 70 years for an environmental reason. So Madden Dam is on the Chagres River, and above Madden Dam is a lake called Alajuela Lake, and Alajuela Lake is where we store the water for the dry season. And above that is Chagres National Park, a completely forested national park. Well, Madden Dam was at the specifications of what it was built to withstand. So we have a research project in the Panama Canal watershed, and it's called the Agua Salud Project. And among other things, we measure stream flow under different land uses. And at our project site, we have the same soils and geology as the whole upper Chagres watershed, so that forested national park. And so that allows us to do some kind of quick and dirty, if you will, or easy extrapolations. So now let's imagine that we deforest Chagres National Park, and let's apply the excess water that we had in our pastures compared to our forest to that area. If we do that, we would have had 100 million cubic meters of water arriving at Madden Dam right when it was at risk of breaching. A cubic meter weighs a metric ton. An elephant weighs a metric ton. So we're talking about 100 million elephants full of water, if you will, hitting that dam right when it was most vulnerable. So we believe that the forest helped save the dam. The forest helped save, really, the canal. And so, well, why should we care about that here in the United States? Well, whether you realize or not, of all the goods that come to the East Coast for the United States from Asia, 40% of those goods come through the Panama Canal. So it has important implications for the United States, but for Panama, were it not for the forest, we would not have this past year celebrated the expansion of the canal and the opening of a new set of locks, but we would be rebuilding the canal, and we'd be rebuilding the economy of Panama. So La Purísima is the name of our storm. And so for us, that was our Superstorm Sandy, or our Hurricane Katrina. And one of the predictions that scientists have great confidence in climate change is it will have more frequent severe weather events, and that the past is not a good prediction of the future. Well, people say that La Purísima was somewhere between a 100 and 300-year event. And so all of us in the room, I'm sure we know that doesn't mean that we're good for another 200 years, right? But it does mean that it's rare. It means it's very rare. Well, less than 2 years after that, 2012, we had another big storm, and we had loss of life in the Panama Canal watershed, and we had roads washed out. And just last year, we had another big storm in the Panama Canal watershed. In the last 6 years, we've had the 3 largest storms of the last 50 years in the Panama Canal watershed. The protection that forests provide from these large storms, that's something that we call ecosystem service, and I'm sure you're all aware of ecosystem services. And there's a whole suite of goods and services that we as humanity, that we get from nature that we often take for granted. And another forest and water-related ecosystem service in the seasonal tropical forest area is the idea of a sponge effect, and that's the idea that where there are these forests that they can absorb water in the wet season and then release it slowly in the dry season. And this has been controversial, but we have consistently shown this at our site. So we don't just study water flows, but we also do a lot of restoration, a lot of reforestation, and we plant trees. And one of the things that we're studying is the idea, can we reestablish, can we restore this sponge effect? And we've shown consistently that by planting trees, we can, in a reasonable time frame, restore the ability of the soil to absorb water. And that is the critical mechanism for the forest sponge, to allow it to absorb the water, and that's the critical mechanism for shunting water away from the overland flow that would go into the rivers that would lead to these big floods. So let's shift and talk about trees. And one tree species, tropical hardwood, that you're probably or may be familiar with is teak. And teak is native to Asia, but it's planted all over the world. And teak is used for furniture, it's used for veneer, and it's used in boat building for boat decks. But one that you might not realize or might not know about is one that I want to show you now. This is my show and tell, is cocobolo. And cocobolo is a craftwood that's native to Panama and adjacent countries, Dalbergia retusa. So I hope that you'll remember cocobolo at the end of this talk. On September 23rd in 2014, less than 3 months after having been sworn in as president of Panama, Juan Carlos Varela went to the United Nations Climate Summit, and he announced to the world his intention to reforest 1 million hectares in the country of Panama. And this was part of his effort, his country's efforts to combat climate change. And through this Alliance pour el Millón, as it's known locally, he was explicitly acknowledging that planting trees in the tropics is one way to adapt to and mitigate the effects of climate change. A hectare is about, what, 2 football fields, a little bit more than 2 football fields. So we're talking about 2 million plus football fields worth of reforestation. This is pretty ambitious for any country, certainly for Panama. So the question is, how do we do it? Well, another story. In 2003, researchers published a paper where they included a carbon baseline for the Panama Canal watershed. So what they did is they used remote sensing. They figured out where all the vegetation is, and they figured out how much carbon's there. And so we have this baseline, and it's important so that we can evaluate future activities at reforestation to know if there's some net positive benefit in carbon sequestration or revegetation. And as part of that scenario, part of that paper, they had different scenarios for the year 2020. And all of the 2020 scenarios had the eastern Panama Canal watershed reforested by the year 2020. And this made sense. This made sense because there were all kinds of incentives for reforestation then. You could get a tax break, and one of my favorites is the reforestation visa. So 75% of what's been planted in Panama traditionally has been teak. And so you might think that these researchers would have thought that by 2020, that the watershed, the eastern watershed, would be reforested in teak, and that's exactly what they thought. But it's 2017, so if this was going to happen, we should be able to go out that area and we should see trees and teak everywhere. But you don't. Instead, you see a mosaic of agriculture and urbanization. So what happened? Well, it turns out that teak needs relatively fertile soils. Teak needs soils with a good loamy soils, as we call them, so a good mix of sand, silt, and clay, and teak does not grow particularly well on acidic soils. And it turns out that these soils are pretty rare in the lowland tropics, and they're really rare in the Panama Canal watershed. So we've conducted an economic analysis. We published a paper to show that just deforesting and putting the cows up on the back 40 and the back land and managing a degraded pasture, that makes more money, or as I often say, it loses less money than teak in the Panama Canal watershed. So when it costs $5,000 to reforest and manage for the first year or so, and if you have 100 hectares and it doesn't grow well or it all dies, that's $500,000 that you have at risk. Well, imagine if you had 1,000 hectares. Or imagine if you had President Varela's 1 million hectares. So, okay, what do we do? Well, let's use native species. Why not? I mean, they're found in the country. They should grow well, right? Well, of course, I'm sure you realize it's not that easy, right? Just because something's native to a country doesn't mean it grows well everywhere, right? There are logistical challenges of figuring out how to germinate the seeds, how to manage the seeds and seedlings in the nursery, and how to get them out at the right time, at scale, to the places you want to reforest. So we ourselves and others around the world, we've done research learning about how to manage the seeds and seedlings in nursery. We published our own guidebooks on how to manage 120 native species in a nursery, and where 64 native species grow well or not under different soil fertility and rainfall conditions. So this is a start. And as part of our research, yes, we have found some native species, some timber species that grow well. They grow really well on these infertile and acidic soils. And so now we go back to cocobolo. So cocobolo is a valuable craftwood in Panama. And so how valuable is it? Well, I heard somebody ask that there. The best teak in Panama is worth about $600 a cubic meter. Cocobolo is reportedly worth $10,000 a cubic meter. So there's, it's so valuable that there's an illegal trade in cocobolo, right? And believe it or not, the cocobolo trade in Panama has been equated with the drug trade. And if you find that hard to believe, I don't blame you. But the fact is that cocobolo have been poached from forests and farms, that government vehicles have been vandalized because of enforcement activities, and that there have been whole containers of cocobolo that have been seized at the ports on their way to Asia that are marked scrap metal. So in our own research on reforestation, we've seen that cocobolo grows pretty well on these acidic or these poor soils. That's great. We only have about 7-8 years worth of growth, and so we've gone out and measured other stands. There's at least one stand where people have planted cocobolo that's 20 years old. And that stand, having measured it and estimated, that is worth over $200,000 a cubic meter if these reports are correct about the value. So imagine what $200,000 could mean to a rural landowner. But let's say I'm wrong. Let's say it's not worth $200,000. Let's say it's only worth a quarter of that. If a rural farmer could make $50,000 a hectare, so for 2 football fields worth of land, in 20 to 30 years, that could make a huge, huge impact on his or her life. So we have challenges in this world, right? And sometimes they seem enormous and insurmountable. But we can use science, and that's what this conference is about. We can use science to overcome these challenges. And the story that I've just told about teak and about cocobolo and native species, for me, that's a hopeful story about how we can use science to understand about forestry so that we can plant the right trees in the right place at the right time and for the right reason. The story that I told about La Purísima, our superstorm, there are different perspectives on that. And you know, first and foremost, we have to acknowledge the incredible professionalism that the Panama Canal Authority had when they managed that storm to avoid, you know, catastrophic loss of life and livelihood. But there's another perspective, and our perspective is about the science. If we hadn't been doing the science, we wouldn't know the extent to which the forest helped save the day, the extent to which that forested national park helped really protect the whole economy of Panama. So today is Earth Day, and I think I'm the first person to mention that in this little talk. And, but you didn't know that, did you? I have 2 boys, and my 2 boys are in Panama City, and they're out on beach cleanup. And that's very similar to what I would have been doing when I was their age, and what I'd probably be doing if I wasn't here. Today there are hundreds of thousands, and we hope that there's many millions of people who are outside doing something good for the earth. And we know that some people are on beach cleanup, some people are protecting wolves, I'm sure, right? Some people are recycling, some people are marching, right? And some people are planting trees. Our research, the research that's being talked about throughout this whole conference, it shows the power of science in helping to guide these efforts so that we're effective and so that they're efficient. And when we combine our science with citizens' great intentions, we can build that sustainable future that we all want and that we all need. Thank you.